Welcome to the Evolution Lab. I'm Matt Roberts, and my mission here is to guide and inspire you to optimize your health, performance, and longevity so that you can live your longest, strongest life as the fittest, healthiest, and most vital version of yourself. My guest today is, it's my brother, John Roberts, who's the training director within Evolution Clubs alongside myself and my team. John has worked with me for many, many years and is highly experienced as a strength conditioning coach, having studied throughout the world to live in the role that he does. In this episode, John and I talk about how to frame a week's programming with the perspective of engineering the best outcomes on health span development over time. Within that, we explore how to use cardiovascular training successfully. We dive deep into the world of strength training. We discuss the work of mobility and the ways in which you can use mobility training. And we go through really the ways in which the body can be prepared for not just living for now, but for living for as long as possible in as active way as it possibly can. Being my brother, the occasional joke in there too about how old he is. So without further ado, here's my conversation with John Roberts. So the purpose of today's episode is really to try to narrow down or create a framework of what someone needs to do to improve their health span. And it's about constructing within this the ideal weekly training program and schedule, what it looks like, what's within it, what they have to do, what the must-dos are, the non-negotiables are within it, and try and look at all the key facets of training, whether that's on the cardiovascular side, resistance training, mobility work, all the other modalities that fit within it, and how we do them, what the client should be doing, what some listeners to this program should be doing, how frequently, and really give a guide over how to construct the perfect program if our goal is to improve health span, termed as being as active as long as possible in your life into your 80s and 90s and so on. So let's start with maybe what that is, which bits fit into that, starting with maybe all the facets, looking at cardiovascular training first and moving on from there.
Well, you got the broad spectrum of the different parts that make up fitness. So you've got cardiovascular training, which is a huge and confusing area which we can go through. Strength, and then strength broken down into its purest form of how much weight we can move in different directions. Hypertrophy, size of muscles, and then power, how we can move resistance through use of speed. Built into all of that, we've got to look at mobility, so how well we move and the understanding of what's the difference between mobility and flexibility, because there's a huge difference there. And then try and build in some degree of interest, competitiveness, sort of the social sports side of it. So all those things have to be wrapped up into a program that lasts a certain amount of time every week.
I want to also today try and dispel some of the thoughts that are out there, I'll put it that way.
But there's a huge amount.
A huge amount shared on everything from people who know a little less than they should be before preaching about it, about frequencies, about the ways in which you should be doing, probably specifically strength training, because it's the one thing that everyone gets, I think, fundamentally massively wrong.
You also there's so many different goals for strength. So everyone wants to give their opinion on what strength is. So it's a case of just trying to work out, okay, if we're going to go down the route of health span, longevity, what does that bit look like? Because everybody will tell you about what strength training is all about and give you different sorts of parameters. But it's the case of trying to say, from everything that's out there, what's the necessity? What's the bit that we've got to try and fit in every single week? Because it's consistency that's the important part. And yes, you can then add to that different sorts of goals over time, but what's the absolute necessity within the training plan?
Yeah, we'll touch back onto definitely short-term gains, which don't translate to long-term gains, and where people fall down on thinking they've made the gain, and actually it falls away again after weeks of doing something. There's no actual ongoing gain return on that. But let's start with cardio work first and go through one of the most common change, what's the dialogue's been recently over which the zone training systems are. People like Peter Tier rave about zone 2 constantly for good reason, very good reason. And we should tell people really what zone 1 is, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5. So start with that first of all. We can then talk through how we construct programs with frequency of each of those events within it as well. So zone 1, first of all, which is basically doing not very much.
What we're doing now,
yeah,
effectively. So we're not doing anything at all. The body's working very, very efficiently, but we're not testing it at all. Zone 2 is then being this new dialogue. And so That's where the body's working with activity. So we're testing it, we're pushing the boundaries of activity, but working very efficiently. So it's where the body's utilising oxygen, it's utilising fat stores as energy. We're not going too hard into the anaerobic, where we can't work for very long. So it's duration based, but it's with a decent amount of output. So everything beyond that is a crossover of aerobic and some degree of anaerobic. So where we start to use other energy processes to produce the output.
Basically, when someone's listening and thinking what they're doing, is it zone 1 or zone 2 or zone 3? It's probably looking at the heart rate zones as the most basic way of looking at that, which is a bit up for debate or certainly disagreement across different platforms. But zone 2 is about 60 to 70% of someone's maximum heart rate. And working max heart rate is another debate again, but if you look at that as being the basic version of 220 minus your age, as being the unbelievably basic way of doing it, roughly 67% of that would be zone 2.
Yes.
Ish.
And out there, if you Google it, you will find everything from 50% to 75% still being called zone 2. But 50% certainly you're not working hard enough, and 75% you are producing too much lactate, too much of the byproducts, and working too hard to really be able to sustain it. So it's sustainable. That's why that 60 to 70 really is the ideal zone for it.
So we'll come back to that as well in terms of how much we do of that and frequency. But zone 3 then above that, 70 to 80% roughly of maximum heart rate, and what that does and why we use it. And then zone 4 probably crosses over the most with that as well for most people in the training programs. Just talk through what zone 3 is, zone 4 is, probably in perceived exertion levels and where you'd find it existing within training programs.
Yeah, so I guess the classic way of describing proper zone 2 is where you know you're working hard. So you're getting hot, you're perspiring. You can hold-ish a conversation. I think there's I forget which one of the American scientists says, but you can't sing.
In zone 3.
In zone 2.
In zone 2.
You shouldn't be able to sing in zone 2. You can hold a conversation, but you can't sing. And that's where people get it wrong.
We tested in the gym with that question.
But that's where people often are using upper zone 1 and thinking they're doing zone 2. So they're going and doing their walk around the park, going after my zone 2. But actually it was still zone 1. Zone 2 is actually much harder than you think, because you have to sustain it for so much longer. Everything above that has a timescale to it. So when you go up to zone 3 and zone 4, you can only sustain those for a period of time. So if you think about someone running the 800 meters or running the mile, they're spent at the end of it. They can't keep on doing that because their energy systems aren't allowing them to keep on doing it at that level. So they are up in those upper levels. And so that's where you get this crossover of the amount of lactate being produced in the body. So the amount of carbon dioxide being produced in the body, it becomes much, much higher than the utilization of the oxygen. That is then you're in your lactate system. But this is classically where a lot of athletes used to train at. That's where you used to have the problems with them training too hard and for too much volume in those zones where you also had a high risk of injury. Yeah. So, because lots of this came from sort of the Scandi countries and came from all of the cross country.
So when you're in zone 3, obviously going to feel as though you're then in a stage where you are, you're now turning slightly more red. You're definitely sweating harder.
Yes.
You aren't singing.
You aren't singing, and you're probably struggling to talk.
Brief kind of conversation as I'm okay, thanks, and that's about it really. And then zone 4 is much more towards. It's getting towards now. You're running fast, running up a hill, going up some staircase quickly.
Zone 4, going into it. Going into it, you already know there's a certain amount of time I can hold this for.
Which is probably about roughly 60 to 90 seconds.
Yeah.
Ish. And then zone 5, the optimum maximum
seconds.
Level. This is sprint.
This is sprinting.
Work.
This is
flat out.
15, 20 seconds of flat out work.
Yeah. Using up creatine phosphate, burning out of that, and there's nothing left in the tank, and that's it before you recover for a long time. So if we get the idea then where the intensity feels like in zones 1 to 5, it's then a question of why we'd use each of these, where they fit into program. So zone 1, we're not going to structure this into a program because it's just walking around day to day, existing, full stop, really.
Beyond doing what we're doing now, you're active. That's it. Which there's a benefit to being active, but that's not exercise.
I spent probably 6 months sat on the bike in the gym without my whoop band on, thinking I was in zone 2. Turned out when I got the whoop band on, I was in zone 1 for 6 months. Because it's just, you have to work quite hard to get to the zone 2. So zone 2, the reason why we use zone 2 frequently is for a number of things, but not least mitochondrial adaptation. So we get the change in the way in which the system uses energy. So we're going to make the body more efficient and make it able to burn away a more even distribution of fatty acids and glycogen and be an ongoing general burner. To get to that point where you get mitochondrial efficiency, what's the frequency to think about for someone using zone 2 per week in their program? How often and for how long?
Well, I mean, if you look at one of the studies we'll bring up, there's a study in Dallas which looked at exactly this. So taking people who were sedentary and trying to look at different, essentially 2 different training modalities, but one of them being slightly lower intensity. So there's the zone 2 type thing, as well as doing yoga and not sort of some core work, not necessarily strength work. The other group doing all of the zone 2 work and doing strength work and doing at least once a week a high intensity cardiovascular output. What they found with group 1 was that by doing some level of zone 2 work twice a week, 60% of them saw what's classed as reasonable cardiovascular improvement. 40% didn't. So even by doing
doing zone 2,
doing zone 2, they were never tested beyond zone 2.
And how long each session was doing that zone 2?
They were doing zone 2 for 45 minutes.
So a long time.
So a decent amount of time. But so 60% saw a measurable cardiovascular improvement, 40% didn't. Obviously, the second group, which we can come on later probably, but the second group who were then building that activity of the zone 2, but then bringing in, after a stage of foundation, bringing the higher intensity cardiovascular work, saw huge improvements, both in terms of cardiovascular strength and then their VO2 output.
So with that in mind, in terms of what that looks like as zone 2. So they always try to do zone 2, obviously, is try and have one thing which can keep you at that same zone throughout.
Yeah.
So it's that sustained intensity for the 40-minute duration, not fluctuating, not changing heart rate, keeping in that kind of, rough zone of 60-70% of your maximum, which probably means sitting on a bike or walking very quickly.
Very quickly and probably unloaded, probably.
Probably loaded with a rucksack on and so on. Yes, get some more weight on there, unless you're seriously deconditioned.
We recently had a journalist in, and she was not particularly fit, and went out, doing walking.
It's very diplomatically put.
with a rucksack, but even then, she couldn't sustain, or she couldn't keep her heart rate high enough to be in the sort of upper level of zone 2. So, walking alone is actually, unless you live in a hilly environment, walking alone is pretty tricky as your chosen zone 2.
But the hilly environment is quite tough too, because you change the duration, the intensity too much. So you're going to fluctuate too much in and out of the zones. So ideally, to get maximum responses.
And with this journalist, a good example was that she started walking, couldn't get it high enough, so he said, well, let's go into a very light jog. The light jog took it up into zone 3.
Yeah, instantly.
So you then go, okay, well, now we're going to do this funny hybrid thing of doing a little bit of walking, then we're going to do a sort of jog walk, then back to walk. So you end up having to slightly flux what you were doing in order to try and keep broadly in that zone 2 band, because it was all zone 2, but you're doing that in zone 2, which works, that's fine.
Yeah, within a tight band, that's okay.
But that was a really concerted effort to try and work out, with heart rate monitor on all the time, how to keep in zone 2. So it's not as easy as you'd think. No,
someone listening in there, I mean, that's the point people listening to, thinking, how do I best burn fat? Let's be honest. That's kind of one of the key things people are looking at all the time as part of our health span longevity drive and focus all the time. Being leaner clearly makes you live for longer. It's undisputed. Mm-hmm. So fat loss is a key factor within this. So the zone 2 thing has to be understood as being it's a must. It's Absolutely. A total go-to. It's non-negotiable. You have to do zone 2 if you want to burn away fat. At the same time, if you want to improve your cardiovascular endurance, you have to do zone 2 to get that base level to be good too. So it hits 2 really good bases.
And also everything you want to do beyond that. So if you want to go and do your high intensity work, or you want to go and do some specific sport, you decide to go and run a half marathon, or anything you want to do beyond it, you've got to build that base first. So everybody needs to go through a phase of building, because the fitter you get, the harder it is to get into zone 2. So for you or I to maintain zone 2,
it's a pain in the butt.
It's really hard work. So naturally, your zone 2 obviously grows with you. The more you do it, the better you get at it. the further away that zone 2 is. So by itself, as a conditioning method, it works incredibly well. And then once you've got that, but it's like, it's kind of thing, it's building the engine. So your zone 2 builds the size of the engine. Then everything else you do, you try to make that engine more and more powerful. But you need to have the capacity of the engine first. That's all zone 2.
In the context of all of this, I'd probably would make the case that actually what we're trying to do with this is, if in the context of having all the time in the world and all the resources in the world, what would you do to build the perfect week of training? And we'll go to then, with zone 2, how often would that be? How frequent would it be? Because that's where, if you had nothing else to do in your days, would you do zone 2 every day? Because you could recover from zone 2 every day.
Yeah.
There's no kind of great downside to it. So would you do it every day? Or would it be sort of for the sake of psychological boredom? You do it maybe 4 or 5 days a week, probably, because it's quite hard unless you absolutely love it.
You could absolutely love it, and as well as physically, psychologically, it would be very beneficial. But I suppose you've got to then layer in what are all the other things that you've got to fit into this program.
Yeah.
Because time is going to be the thing that holds
Even
you
if
back.
you had all the
Even
time, it's more having the energy and the ability
you've got to
recover.
work out how many hours am I going to put aside to my health and fitness routine, and therefore, if I'm doing an hour of zone 2 every day, what am I sacrificing elsewhere?
But if we were to make the assumption that time was not an issue, and we were looking at the degree of recovery needed after each session, not just zone 2, but everything else beside and in general, to allocate maybe 4 days per week towards doing zone 2, it probably is about the sweet spot, 40 minutes, 45 minutes.
Three to four.
Yeah, 3 to 4 to make sure you're getting that
Because you've got to
response
think
needed.
about what you do in the upper training zones.
Yeah.
So beyond that conditioning level, we know, the stats show us, that in terms of longevity, so living as healthy a life as possible for as long as possible, we have got to get our VO2 score, so our basic understanding of how strong the heart is, or the cardiopulmonary system as a whole, that score has got to be as high as it can possibly be. So zone 2 alone won't do that. Zone 2 will build the engine. We've got to do specific VO2 improving training to be able to up that score, which then has a direct correlation on longevity of life.
So we'll come back to the numbers on the zone 2 in a second, but with the VO2 in mind, we'll jump way ahead and look at the intensity of what you need to do for VO2 developments, the volume of oxygen that circulates around your body, the VO2 score that you have. This is a key score that without question predicts mortality, longevity, because it's directly correlated with the two things. So to improve your heart capacity, oxygen circulation capacity, what's the intensity we need to get to? And you've got a study as well about this, quite specific, to get the returns that you need.
There are loads of studies out there, and they will all show slightly varying degrees of time under intensity. And so I guess the most studied one is probably the Norwegian 4x4 protocol. And so that's where you are doing 4 minutes at a reasonably high, so sort of 80% of your maximum output for 4 minutes, with a 3 minute recovery, full recovery, right back down to zone 2.
But maximum output differs from maximum heart rate.
Yes.
So let's go through because actually the thing is, someone will look at 80% will think, that's fine, that's sustainable, but it's not what we're talking about. It's of your overall capacity.
Yeah.
What does that feel like? And what in reality, what zone is that?
Yeah, and that's that whole thing. Going back to the whole 220 minus your age. I mean, it works as a real. Well, it doesn't really work. I mean, it's a field score that we've used for years, but it doesn't really work.
No.
And unfortunately, and I guess, and to a degree, the fitter you get, the more inaccurate that number.
Well, yeah,
becomes.
I mean, you wear a Whoop device like I do as well, and what's the maximum you've had on your heart rate?
On here, mine is 196.
And you're like 65
I'm 54 years old. so it's way above what my predicted is.
Exactly.
And so if I used my 220 minus my actual age, not 64, then, I wouldn't be, I'd hardly be working. So,
but that's
the thing, is understanding those
what the
numbers.
maxims are.
Yeah.
So if someone's doing VO2 work, then the output at 80% is up it's probably like 90%, 95% of maximum heart rate if you can get that level worked out. Because it's definitely, in the last minute, you are pushing
You're pushing hard, but it's sustainable for 4 minutes, and you've got to do 4 of them.
Yeah.
So that's where again, if you look at the Norwegian protocol alone, that's where this understanding of where I place the energy level is important. As you don't want to be, you don't want to start doing 4 minutes and end up on the fourth and doing 2 minutes.
Yeah, can't do it at all. Yeah.
You are trying to maintain 4 lots of 4. So that's where for most people.
But with that protocol, actually, it's a good point. If you're doing 4 lots of 4, and the first one you push in the last minute is hard, and you're close to falling off the bike, and then walk around if you can for 4 minutes, come back and do it again. Are you better off trying to get to the point, rather than pace yourself in the first one, to make sure you can get to the fourth one? Are you best off just reducing the resistance and intensity in the third and the fourth ones?
Well, you are going to have to.
Relative
You're
change
going to have
anyway.
to, because, and also the less fit you are, the more you're going to have to adapt those 4. Because ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to produce the same output for each of the 4.
Yeah.
So if you keep the same number on your bike, you're actually working harder with each 4 and probably failing. So what you're trying to do is try to repeat the same level of output for you. And that's also where we look at the rest period. I mean, the Norwegian was a 3-minute rest period. But a lot of these protocols are given 60 seconds rest, 90 seconds rest. For most people, that's not enough.
Can't do it, it's possible.
If you're working that hard, getting your heart rate that high, you can't use time as your recovery mechanism. You've got to use heart rate still. Because not only is fitness a huge factor in that, but also duration. The amount of time you need to recover after the first one versus the third one, or 10th one if you're using a different protocol, that distance gets wider and wider, or longer and longer in terms of time. So you've got to keep coming back to the same point, so you can try to repeat the same effort level, not each time coming back to a higher heart rate in between, making each effort harder and harder and harder.
People might use specific timed recoveries, of course, for different reasons. But with a VO2 score in mind, it needs to have a certain degree of full recovery to be able to get to the next one to be the right level of volume and intensity. That's the point, isn't it, really?
Yeah. VO2 training is hard by the fact that it's that in-between level of time. It's much easier to go, I'm going to do a 30-second blast, 50-second blast, then I'll recover, then do 15 seconds again. And there's a lot to be said for that type of training. But VO2 training means that you're sitting, you're not just all out going for it. It's that upper level of where you're still working to a degree aerobically, but into the anaerobic zones. So it's hard, and the hard part is that you're trying to hold this duration as well. But as the research shows, the positive effect of doing that is huge. They were showing if you could get your body up to a point where you, for your age, were close to elite level of VO2 score, it was putting nearly 6 years of extra life onto your lifespan. Even being just in the stage below, being in the good range, you're putting 3.6 to 4 years on your lifespan. That's before you include any other factors in. So the returns on it are huge. You just need to be able to do it in the right way.
In terms of frequency of that, because the research in that program was that you had to do it twice per week doing VO2 work in that kind of style and format.
Yeah, you're doing once a week of doing that format. So the Norwegian, which was the hardest one. That was the hardest session they were doing. And then one other session which was interval based, slightly shorter intervals, but still had an intensity to it. So it was 2.
Shorter being 60 to 90, 120 seconds, somewhere there.
Yeah, so you had 2 sessions where you were working with intensity. And then in that program, it was then 2 sessions that you were working sort of zone 2.
So effectively,
but that was with they were trying to make sure that people weren't working over 5 hours. So that was taking this idea
an overall
of
volume being
overall in the week
on the cardiovascular training 5 hours.
On the training
overall
full stop.
training full stop.
Yeah.
So on that basis, then, so the zone 5 work, the VO2 type stuff, it's really once per week.
Yes.
Probably 10 days or even 14 days potentially in a kind of overall periodized program. It might be that.
Depending where you are in terms of your fitness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you're then doing the zone 4 type stuff, zone 3 to 4 type stuff, twice per week, that probably gives the optimum breakdown of how much to be doing in terms of interval training, how to get the VO2 expansion, not to over fatigue, to get the ideal mixture.
Yes.
Before getting to sports editions, so on as well.
based on fitness level. I mean, again, the protocol with that piece of research from Dallas, they had 6 months with these people. Now, bear in mind, they start off a sedentary lifestyle, but they had 6 months of building up very gradually to get to this point that we're discussing. So they didn't jump in on day one, doing this high intensity work. They worked with their zone 2, they gradually brought in interval training, and after 6 months, that's where they felt they were now had the program fit for purpose.
Yeah, so day one beginner would focus very much on, let's just get some zone 2 conditioning done.
Absolutely, 100%.
Build that really nice base into there, get some adaptation.
Just see how the heart rate rises. Can the heart rate maintain for a period of time, or does it just continue to rise?
Yeah.
And just kept on doing that for a period of time.
But if we assume our generic person with health span goal is semi-conditioned, not super conditioned, not a beginner, they're medium, somewhere moderate, then it would be on the breakdown pretty much you're doing that sort of breakdown 4 times a week doing the zone 2 stuff, once a week maybe doing the VO2 high level stuff.
Yes.
I'd say the VO2 so once a week. I mean, that actually might be sport, kind of. If you're a really good tennis player, the rallies kind of go on for maybe
fit really nicely within that
enough.
episode.
Yeah, so but it varies, of course, in the match. You're getting enough of an overload within it to maybe have that ticked off the list. But if you were purely clinical setting, all the time in the world, what would you do? You'd be sat on a bike doing a certain thing, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, once per week. You go twice a week doing something which is going to tick the box of doing that 90 seconds, a minute of workload, resting for similar, slightly longer, probably actually between those ones, twice per week, and then doing your zone 2 stuff probably 3-4 days per week. And that would probably tick off your cardiovascular work to improve the VO2, to get the adaptation of the mitochondria, to get some increased overall blood volume or oxygen volume, and be healthy well.
Yeah, and that then sits with this, with all those terms as polarization training. So it's you're polarizing your cardiovascular training. You're doing things that are down that zone 2, and then you're doing things which are up in the zone 4 or 5. And all the bits in the middle, you're not really touching. So you're only ever working when there's a definite reason for doing it and a definite outcome from what you're doing.
Which begs the question that someone going for like a sort of 30-minute long medium pace run, you have to question what the goal might be, because it doesn't do enough for you. You might really like it though. So you might be on a psychological basis, it could be brilliant, doing your 5K run, slow pace. And
it's where you have these sort of weekend warriors who go out on their bikes and thrash around in zone 4, and then come back exhausted. I think, well, what was that? Other than maybe it's social.
Social, you felt good for doing a.
But that actually didn't tick a box as accurately as you'd wanted to be ticked.
Yeah, so again, clinically speaking, if you were to make the perfect program, it wouldn't be the ideal.
No.
Yeah, again, it's about really taking the ideal and how you then water that down to make it fit in someone's lifestyle, which we can come back to the importance of each area.
And also making sure that you have that kind of thing of people going, well, I'm doing all this exercise, but I'm not achieving. Well, how close to the clinical ideal was it? Are you doing lots that's non-specific? Or are you actually getting close to this blueprint where you know that each time you go and exercise, there's something you're definitely achieving? And when we put all the blocks together, the master plan works.
If you add up all the minutes of what needs to be done in the course of a week on the cardio side between those different zones, it's around roughly 202 to 250 minutes per week-ish of work.
Yeah, I mean, your 2 high intensity are 28 to 35 minutes each.
Yeah.
And then you've got your zone 2 on top of that.
Which is a big chunk of time.
Which has got to be 45 minutes at least. And you can go
3-4 days a week. So it's at least 200-ish minutes of work. Yeah. So it's a solid 3 and a bit hours of work time just on that. And people don't, I think, understand that's the duration that needs to be there as the input. And you're walking the dog in the morning doesn't count. Unless you're doing it very specifically with a dog that can go to zone 2 with you as well. Which is fine, it can be done. It has to be very much sustained duration to fit within that volume of cardio work, and within that volume has to have certain hit points at zones 4 and 5, definitely. Okay, we'll come back to that in terms of how we construct our week later on, but if we move on to mobility work is one of our facets, where mobility work fits into the programming. And the difference between also mobility work and flexibility work, because they're 2 separate things. Yeah. Let's just go through what mobility training actually is and what flexibility training actually is and where they'd be used.
Well, so flexibility, it's when we test clients, we'll test their flexibility. So the flexibility of every
range
joint,
of motion around a joint,
but is a range of motion that can be achieved and often with help. So if we look at someone's hamstring, it's you can always take someone's leg and you can move it towards them. You can see how much range they've got on their hamstring.
You stop when they go red in the face.
Or with the ballerinas with the floor.
Yeah.
Which comes first. But that's flexibility. So that is how far can that joint, the muscles around that joint get in sensory range of motion. Mobility is if you ask that person to do the same thing, but what they're going to do is they're going to use their hip flexors and those squeeze the hip flexors to bring the leg towards them. How far can they get that?
So they're actively stretching, aren't they? They're actively stretching themselves, actively mobilizing themselves.
Yeah.
So
what range of motion can you create rather than effectively falling into? And what's required for mobility is to have the strength, and ideally the strength, all around the major joints that allow you to go through different ranges of motion, and those range of motion should be as long as possible, but with strength, and with strength comes stability. So if a joint is just flexible, or hyperflexible, hypermobile, that comes with intrinsic problems as well, because you have instability built into that joint. Mobility has all of the range of motion that you want to try and have in that joint, but has stability and strength built into it. So you have functionality of all the joints that you want with this range of motion. And if we look at the aging body, one of the most notable things you find is it becomes less mobile. So movement patterns become harder, and the ability to control and stabilize becomes harder. It's one of the most obvious things to see. There was the film that had De Niro and Joe Pesci in it, where they aged them.
The Irishman.
The Irishman. They made them younger. So they
looked like young people, but they ran like old people.
But the movement. So facially they're young, but you could tell they were all old because as soon as they got up and moved around, they moved like old men in this case. So that's all right. Mobility. The more mobile the body and the more stable and strong the body, the more that bit of the process isn't there. And so that for me is one of the most important parts of this sort of longevity program, is maintaining youthful movement. And youthful movement has muscles that are strong, has muscles that are able to move in lots of different directions and stabilize lots of different directions with great flexibility built in to become mobility.
So pre-session, someone's routine should look like not just having a quick stretch by a tree somewhere before going for a run, or getting in the gym and stretching out your pec and then expecting to be great. What does it look like? It's some simulation, effectively, because mobility works a bit more like simulation before doing training.
Drills.
Yeah.
You're drilling the body for the thing that you're about to go and do. So you're trying to make sure that, well, you know what's in the program, and so therefore you're making sure that the movements that you're going to put under load in your program. That load can be speed, running, or it could be load in terms of strength work with weights applied. But you are aware of the thing you're about to do, and you're mobilizing all of the joints and manipulating all the muscles around those joints to make that movement as easy as possible. So the best picture to draw, if you think of the joints that are best designed for movement, it's the hip sockets and the shoulder joints, the ball and socket joints. So they're they have the greatest range of motion,
articulation,
articulation of all joints. So all of the movements that we make, ideally, they're coming from those two sets of joints, and everything around those joints needs to be able to brace. So, in terms of the aging process, if we think about the hips and how we keep them as mobile and strong as possible, we think about the shoulders and how we keep them as mobile and strong as possible. That will prevent the aging process. That will give us longevity of good movement and amazing levels of activity that keep us youthful.
Do you reckon the lack of mobility comes more from lack of people moving, or lack of strength changes due to hormone changes? Because there's a study I saw recently about women in the menopause, and when the study actually got looked at in detail, they found that, this is horrifying for women listening, I'm sure, is that it wasn't due to a hormone change they got less flexible, they just did less. Likewise for the sarcopenia as well, loss of muscle mass. They put it down to being the hormone changes themselves. In reality, it might have been part of that, but the hormone changes made them feel like doing less, and therefore flexibility decreased enormously. But it wasn't specifically down to the hormone changes themselves.
No, I think
response to it.
I think it's function. It's what we do. We can.
If you don't
use
it,
go
you
out
lose
and
it.
do exactly that. And so there's always been an acceptance that as we get older, we do less.
Well, that goes hand in hand with the menopause thing too. So it was a whole thing where menopause comes along for females, and therefore you have to now take it easy. And to a degree, you do. You can't just go hammering into everything and expect it all to be okay. Some days that can't happen. Some days it can. But by doing less, there's going to be less response. So you're going to lose flexibility and lose strength along the way. And for anybody, male or female, it's the exact same thing. The expectation, you're right, is that you get to a certain point, horrifyingly low, probably 50 plus, and it's assumed that, well, you're going to slow down a bit now. Well, bullshit to that. It's completely the wrong attitude to have. It's all about being able to do all those things when you're 70, 80, 90, who knows going forward, plus years old. So, but we know from the evidence, and we'll come back to in strength training in a moment, about sarcopenia, is that sarcopenia, if you're left unchecked, is a huge problem, but worked on is not even an issue.
No.
At all.
All reversible.
Yeah, but the same thing with mobility as well, then, isn't it? It's where, left unchecked, we just get stiff. You sit in a chair watching Netflix too long, you just get stiff. If you don't do anything, you just get, it goes hand in hand with just doing nothing. You're going to be able to do nothing.
If you look at I guess it's like the queues in the physio department, the amount of people who are all with either desk-bound or device-bound problems coming up is just increasing. So this is physical structural problems within the body based on our lifestyle, the things we now do. So walking down the street, not looking where they're going, and on their phones. But at the same time, they're internally rotated through the shoulders, they're flexed through the spine, they're flexed through the cervical spine, and then they go to the physio because they go, I get this pain across the back of my neck. Well, you have, because so much now of your time is spent in this very strange posture. So
there was a client came in recently to the gym, and one of the guys was telling me that he'd come in because his wife told him, "You got to go because you look like a mole." His head's going forwards, and it's just he's at his desk the entire time. But that's bent over position.
That's the new posture, and it's horrendous. But it is that thing of everything that we do day by day that creates a negative posture, we can reverse by day doing the exercises that do the opposite. We've got a client who's in his 80s who you lie on his side, used to be able to go that far, and now can go right over and touch the floor behind him. So that's at 80 years old. That's, if you can do it at 80,
you're leveraging around the gym, obviously. But it's true. But the point is, at any age it can be done. Yeah. You respond at any age. If everything else you're doing assists and benefits that, as in you're eating well, come back to all those things later on, the rest strategies too. But if you've got other things that you should be doing well and supporting yourself in doing the work, then you respond. Simple as that.
Yeah.
The body's very good at adapting.
The body's an incredibly clever thing, and that we'll come to with the training later on, because that with the training you've got to keep on changing it, because the body adapts so incredibly quickly, but it will adapt negatively and positively incredibly quickly. So go back to the whole idea of drills. The more positive drills that we put on the body in order to, in this case, increase mobility, the body will adapt. It will do it really, really quickly. You just need to maintain those drills all the time. So it becomes like a daily, we talk about again, if we try to break down our week of activity, yes, there's the mobility that we do before our activities, but arguably we get up, walk around a bit once we got up in the morning, maybe even have a hot drink, food. Then really what we should do is then a quick 5 minutes of just mobility drills, predominantly shoulder, hips, before we then go out for the day. Because what it means is that from that point on, everything you do during the day, you are now going to do better, because you've activated the body, you've got it more mobilized, you've taken all of the posture from work the day before or from sleep out of the body and sent it out on the day.
And this might be actually applied resistance mobility drills too. It's not a case just of doing, here's some stretching. It's not like that at all.
No, it's activation.
Bands around the ankles, it can be all the things.
It's not, so when you think about mobility, it's not about stretches. There's a degree of range of motion improvement, but a massive part of that is activation drills.
Muscle stimulation.
So we're stimulating the muscles, the ones that we do all the time. If we're thinking about the hips in particular, then activating the glutes, muscles at the bottom, vitally important to make sure that the pelvis is sitting in the right place, because that's the foundation for all leg movements and everything that goes on in terms of the health of the spine. So we've got to make sure the pelvis is in the right place and that all the muscles around are activated. So when we talk about mobility, the activation of those muscles is as important, if not more, than the flexibility part of mobility.
So work like clams, banded clams,
your bridges,
bands around the ankles, doing side steps down the room, like a crab walking, that kind of thing.
Every muscle that wraps around the hips, you activate all of those
But that should be perfect work should be every morning. Ideally, do that. But before a session,
if we're drawing up the perfect week scenario, then every morning post breakfast, that's in there, and then before
training as well to
you
reactivate
redo it
and get going.
Because you probably come from the office to the thing you're about to do. So you did it well in the morning, but now you've been sat down, as we are. Knees have been hinged, hips have been hinged. If we now go and try and do something, there's an impairment there. So post doing nothing, you then go and activate everything and then do the actual physical activity you want to try and do.
Will yoga or Pilates fit into that category?
Yeah, they do. Of course they do. And they play a big part. All these things, it's like jigsaw. So all these things play a part. The problem, or the thing you'll be very careful of, is you don't oversell any of the different activities. So, without wanting to offend every yoga instructor out there, yoga is amazing from the point of view of flexibility. But if we start to think that yoga is the only thing I need in terms of muscle structure and cardiovascular improvement, then it's going to miss. So in putting together your ideal week's program, you've got to go, which bits do I need? And therefore, which activities fit into the box of that thing? And then put those things in there, but don't overpromise. Don't sort of go, well, I'm going to do yoga and that's going to be everything I need to try and do. It won't be. No matter how good or bad your yoga teacher, there's only so much that yoga can do. So you've got to make sure that you're doing the right things for the right purpose.
Yeah, it's more of a supplementary compared to everything else you might want to do.
You could be amazing at Pilates, but you then go in the gym and you can't do squats with much weight in the shoulders, or you can't do split squats very well because you haven't.
It's all goal specific, isn't it?
It's always and the body adapts to what you show it. So if you've never shown it strength training, you've only ever shown it Pilates, it will adapt really well to Pilates and take all the benefits of Pilates. But you're not a fully rounded.
Well, I did a launch of our bone scanning unit recently, and there was a discussion that was interesting around Pilates being used great, and it's great for bone density building. And I had to just want to intervene on the basis that it's just complete rubbish. And if you have, again, it's all about a certain goal you're trying to hit. If your goal is to hit a certain thing, in this case bone density, you're doing Pilates just won't be intensive enough. Not to say it's a bad thing, it's a very good thing.
If you've never done anything, Pilates will have a bit of an impact on bone density because you've never done anything. So you've never applied a resistance.
Scratch, then it's easy enough.
So as we were saying before, it's this foundation thing.
Yeah.
It could be part of your foundation. And it should always be part of your stability and your spinal health and everything else. But if you continue down that route of I want to do everything for my bone density, there's a point pretty quickly that you'll hit where now the Pilates isn't as effective as it was on bone density, and you've got to find something else which applies more load, more tension, which would be strength training or do something with an impact force, but something which will now take you beyond stage one and into the next stages.
But it might fit really well into the bucket of great improvements in mobility,
absolutely,
core development. So you've got to know what it does. Yeah. What it does is that really effectively and well.
I mean, Pilates is a good example because you've got to go back to the foundation of it. When Joseph Pilates designed Pilates, it was not, on the whole, it wasn't much like it looked today. It was designed for one purpose. It was designed to put injured dancers
rehab device
back on the stage. It's rehab. So it's still brilliant to this day for rehab. It's been sent off in all different directions. But if you go to somebody who is pretty much still along the lines of what Joseph Pilates designed, it's brilliant for that.
Yeah, I know guys we send to do Pilates in the clubs. Those that do heavy strength work and all the other cardio work and do a bit of Pilates as well, do phenomenally well overall because they've got great control, range of motion,
great body understanding. So when you try and layer in technical exercises, they're really good at it because they already have that body awareness. And that's where if you marry the right things up, it really works. Yeah. But like I say, you don't overpromise.
No, but that's why it fits into that mobility core development bucket really well, potentially, which is all good. Probably the biggest one of these, and these are in no order of importance, so I've kind of almost left, I guess, probably in reality, the biggest one to last in the main three sequence of strength training. So I think if you could choose one thing to do and nothing else, you have to do strength work to make sure the system's working well. It'd be a close call between that and doing VO2 development, I know. But the strength work, without that, you can't do anything anyway. So it's a question of then looking at how we use strength work best in the context of health span. episodes in future we're going to do about specific work on strength development and where you'd use that,
goes
how
in
it
lots of
creates
directions.
sport-specific work and so on, etc. as well. But with the point of view of overall health and well-being, we should just talk through all the many types of strength work that exists, different facets of that, why we do each of those, where they fit in, how you choose which things suit the individual with this goal in mind of health span creation, and how that helps to prevent muscle mass loss, sarcopenia, how we then extend health span off the back of that. Let's just start maybe with probably the key goals then. So probably the ones that everyone knows about really, everyone thinks about weight training as being strength-based, obviously. Size is the other thing that everyone has, as most females, a fear of size development.
Yep.
Let's go through what you need to do to try and build some size. There's strength, endurance, and within all that there's power. Just go through then within the context of how we'd rank the order of importance to building a program, what it looks like, where are we focusing the attention?
Well, it will vary to who you talk to. For me, the most important part there is strength. So being as strong as you can, straight strength, as strong as you can possibly be. Because once you get to that point where you have a strong body, you can then adapt that body in whichever direction you want to go to.
We should define what strength is then.
Yep.
In a sense, because if you've got to get people's heads around what that looks like. Strength is not going to the gym necessarily lifting that thing for 12 big reps, doing whatever it might be. This is out and out pure strength.
Yeah. So this is low reps. So this is reps, up to sort of 6 to 8 reps.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 reps. Somewhere.
Yeah. And you're going to need lots of rest in between doing it. It takes a huge amount of physical control through the whole body, and that sort of neuromuscular response, because the skill required to do that movement means that the brain, the nervous system, and the muscle system all have to work incredibly hard. It also means that on the whole, you'll be doing a lot more sort of closed chain exercises where you're physically moving the body. You're not sat in a machine pushing something. You're physically moving the body, so the response through the whole body is huge. That for me is what strength training is. And so, no matter how old you are, there's a degree of pure strength that you have to have. And then from that well-trained point, you can take it off in whatever direction you want to. You can make it very, very sport specific. You can go down the hypertrophy route. You can do whatever you want. But the strength, that's the one factor that, like I say, maintains this neuromuscular response. It has the much greater sort of cognitive processing required. Coordination requirements for it are much, much higher. So you have all those things that benefit you for a long life. You have a huge amount of strain caused on the body and therefore on the bones. So in terms of bone health for a long life, it adds to all those things. So that for me is why that is the most important thing to try and work on. Now there's again, like all these things, there's a foundation stage. We don't jump straight in at 3 to 5 reps. So there is this stage that we go through where you're making all the body stronger, and that's the important thing as well. It's all the body. It's getting the right sequencing. So I guess every teenage boy tends to go to the gym and does all the front of their body because that's what they're
see.
Yeah, exactly, the mirror muscles. What we're talking about here is getting balance across the whole body. So when we talk about the important movements, we're almost certainly talking about some degree of hip and knee hinge, like a squat type movement. We're almost certainly talking about some sort of hip hinge movement alone, like a deadlift movement. And those are bilateral, both legs working, and unilateral, single legs working. And then you have a horizontal push-pull in the body. So push it away from you and then pull towards you. You probably ought to add into that some type of anti-rotational move exercises. So exercises that mean you've got to brace incredibly hard whilst you do something else that's going on. Those are your 5 foundation movements. You can then layer into that, obviously, your vertical push and pull movements, but that's only if your shoulder joints allow you to get into the right position. There's no point doing an overhead press if your shoulder joints aren't working.
With a person who's our generic person who's got a health span thing in mind and they're a medium level of fitness right now, if you applied metrics to each of those key sort of 4 or 5 or 2 or 3 of them maybe exercises, let's say it's a deadlift, it's a squat, maybe a barbell press on a bench, to be considered to be at the approximate level where the scene is being good strength. What's the rough percentage of body weight they should be aiming towards trying to be able to lift in each area?
So if you go through them stage by stage, and again, this is age related. So if you're 50 plus, and to get to a point where you've got a decent level of strength, then ideally you should be able to deadlift and squat between 1 and 1.2 times your body weight, which is a decent amount of weight. Certainly on the deadlift, you should be able to do about 1.2 times your body weight. On the squat, potentially one times body weight.
Now, if most are going to a gym, if they haven't experienced it before, that's a ton of weight.
That's a big
So
weight.
try to lift up doing a deadlift, with if you weigh 70 kilos, trying to lift up effectively around 84
85,
kilos,
yeah.
somewhere there,
Yeah.
then that's a huge weight. Again, this is someone's conditioned to get to that point.
Progress to that point.
But it's still,
But then that becomes your marker. So you sort of going
but
forward,
it's
you
a
go,
surprising level.
absolutely.
For most people listening to that, that's going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe it's going to be that degree of weight to lift up.
Yeah.
Try squat, same thing. It's really heavy numbers in there. But that's what needs to happen. Simple as
absolutely.
that. That's the level people have got to understand to get to.
Yeah.
You've got to keep on adapting the body. The reason being, the stats on sarcopenia, muscle loss, are huge, aren't they? They're lost per decade.
It's about 8%.
8% of
On
muscle
average,
mass
8%
lost
muscle
from the
mass
age
from
of...
the age of about 30. So we peak at our late 20s. From 30 onwards, we're losing about 8% of muscle mass every decade.
If you did nothing, or minimal.
Minimal.
Minimal,
I'd say.
rather than
It
nothing.
wasn't
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
But I mean, it means you can get to 75 to 80 years old with only 60% of the muscle that you started with, which is horrific to think about.
With all the risk associated with that,
Absolutely.
in terms of... Because keeping with muscle loss, of course, is a few things. You get a drop in your burn rate, your calorie burn rate, because you're less active tissue.
Metabolism is not.
That'll drop down enormously. Gain in fat at the back of that because you're not burning as quickly. But probably more importantly is that when you haven't got that muscle mass there, when you get into your 60s and 70s, then the likelihood of falling and damaging is huge.
Just the ability to hold your frame.
Yeah.
To be able to hold your frame and to be able to then deal with quick changes of movement, change of direction, becomes a frightening hard thing. And none of that needs to be the case, really. If everybody kept themselves to certain sort of key strength factors, this wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, because the thing is, if you do the appropriate way of training, we'll come back to what that is in a moment exactly. If you do the right form of training, the muscle mass loss per decade is minimal.
Absolutely.
Like 0.2,
0.5.
0.5%, somewhere there per decade. So it's tiny. So 30, 40 years on, you've lost maybe 2%, 3%, somewhere there. You're not going to even notice it over time. So it's really, really small levels.
We pulled the stats out with the NHS with back care.
Yeah.
£3.5 billion last year just on remedial work for back care. Now you've got to go, well, if we replace some of that muscle loss in the population, that number would come down dramatically. And so that's where we are. We haven't got enough of the population who are maintaining some of this basic muscle structure, and that's why this number is going up. That 8% per decade
Quickly,
is going up. It's not going. We're not going the right direction with it. So if that gets to the point where we're losing 10 or above 10% per decade going forward, the results will be horrific.
So go back to them, for someone listening to this, how do I go about this? In terms of frequency of hitting one muscle area, and in terms of volume per week, we should try and achieve within one area, one muscle group, one muscle fiber band group. Let's just go through frequency of how we hit parts of the body, and how much is then overtraining as well. So on a muscle area, so if you're trying to train your pecs, for example, what's a frequency ideally per week?
Well, if we go back to that's the American studies, they looked at training twice a week and training the full body. So you're training all those major movement patterns twice a week. And
this was the Wisconsin-based study.
This was the Wisconsin study, and they saw substantial improvement in strength and therefore muscle mass and therefore posture improvements as a result. So that's the minimum, and with all these, again, with all these studies, the one overriding factor that comes out of it, again, go back to that Dallas one with the cardiovascular, the one comment that came out of it was that consistency is the most important thing, and also time. The Dallas study they said it's 2 years. It takes 2 years to get to the point where you've got a manageable level of fitness that, as long as you do the right things, can then stay with you. But it's a 2-year plan, and if you don't have 2 years in mind, you're not going. The likelihood of failure is high. So if we start from that point there, where you are twice a week going in the gym, and you are hitting all those major movement patterns, that's your starting point. Anything less than that, you're not going to get the results.
So it looks like it's 15 to 18 sets per muscle per week to achieve to get done for the biggest returns.
If we're talking about having the 5 movement patterns, and we're doing those 5 movement patterns twice a week, we are going to need to try and train at least 3 sets of your upper ranges for each of those. So yeah, we've got something like 30 sets of exercise that you're going to be doing per week as a minimum, and that is for a non-specific, just health-orientated goal marker. So if you want to do more, if you want to achieve more than that or add elements to it, then there's the volume that goes up.
So in reality, it's probably more like 40 to 50 sets per week to fit into a workout program routine to achieve best results.
If we're looking at best results
returns.
and we're trying to get this longevity message out, then yes.
Yeah. So in theory, within one good training session, you might get you're going to get solid 20 sets done. You could train hard twice a week, probably a third time per week, to get the intensity, the volume you need to get done.
You could. You almost think looking at 3 times a week if you were trying to maximise this blueprint that we're talking about.
So with that in mind, though, if someone's training, and often people do 5 days per week doing strength work, how much of that's a waste of time? Because there's no way for most people you can get the recovery time needed to optimize, maximize return, whether it's on strength or a size basis, being that frequent, hitting the same areas again and again and again.
No, and especially when you're trying to do all these other things as well. If you're trying to maximize, as we've said, your VO2 output, and you're trying to make yourself as strong as possible, whilst building in some desire for sort of cosmetic enhancement, build the size of the muscle up, and you got all of your zone 2 stuff, which keeps the engine size the way you want it. It's a huge amount of output that you've got to try and find.
Because the Wisconsin study, what that showed was it was doing specifically supersetting 3 days per week, I think, from memory, at a high intensity rep range of 8 to 10 back-to-back sets. Then agonist, antagonist.
Exactly, so you're working across the body. So you work one side of the body straight to the other side of the body. Yeah. And the beauty of that, as pointed out, was that with the right exercise choices, because what you were doing was you were increasing the range of motion on one side of the body by working the other side of the body, and then vice versa, then rest. And so primarily this found, this again was for 50 plus. This was done, I'm sure it would be the same with females, but this was done on 50 plus males. But what it showed was that to get the greatest level of strength and muscular development
and human growth hormone release.
So you had this ability to have hypertrophy at the same time as building strength. You did this supersetting with the rest period coming after the second exercise and superset, and then you repeat it.
Which for those listening as well, besides anything else, it's unbelievably time saving.
Absolutely. The workouts were 40 minutes long.
Yeah.
So you meant that in terms of trying to plan your week, you had a huge amount of intensity, really, really time efficient, that fits the alongside.
So rather than doing your bro split of doing, practicing one day, back on the next day, you might as well just put it into one session, do your supersetting, agonist, antagonist, break it into 2 approaches that you could do upper low body splits on the days. You might do 4 days a week doing 2 of each.
Yeah.
You could do, or you might just do it as being a whole body thing within one session.
Also,
get away with it.
As we get older, our ability to keep on doing those pure anaerobic strength exercises becomes less.
Yeah, you can't take the volume.
The idea of actually efficiently working for an hour in the gym.
And you speak for yourself.
50 plus, couldn't do it. But so therefore the idea of going in, you do your 40 minutes, do it really effectively, and get out. Yeah, you can cope with that.
But actually, even with if time wasn't the issue anyway, because of the nature of the human growth hormone response from doing it, it's still worth doing that way anyway.
Absolutely.
Irrespective.
No, it is.
So besides that whole thing, I've only got 2 hours a week, actually reality to maximise return, it's still the best.
It still works.
Yeah. There's a great bit of data actually. There's a study, I think it's ACSM, this quote, it's about the effects of doing strength work with all that in mind on a risk of death. I mean, strength training appears to be associated with 10 to 17% lower risk of all-cause mortality. cardiovascular disease, total cancer, diabetes, and lung cancer. Two key outcomes of strength training are muscle hypertrophy and muscle strength gain, associated with reduced all-cause mortality. So I mean, there's
But so that one's 70%. That Dallas one, which is the VO2 cardiovascular, 80%. 80% reduction in all-cause mortality. So this argument of really focusing your training and making sure that every time you train, you are achieving something. If that's 70, that's 80%. In terms of trying to prevent your early death, you're hitting all the markers. And so the blueprint really starts to take shape if you're doing it this way.
What's amazing within that number, I think, is not just a case of the obvious things about not falling so, it's the reduction in total cancer and lung cancer, quite specific on where they were. There's kind of quite extreme versions of getting things. So yes, you're going to be stronger. Yes, you've got obviously decreased risk of diabetes, and your heart gets stronger because you're working out when you're doing the program hard.
Yeah.
But to reduce that inflammatory response by virtue of doing strength work, that's fascinating in itself and shows it's an absolute must go to. But the intensity has to be at the level in which you're getting that overload and getting hormonal responses and endocrine responses within the blood markers to make sure that changes. So it's
one of the other studies showed, as we get older, the heart becomes less elastic, less effective as a pump. It showed that by getting some of this training correct, you had a 20% increase in the elasticity of hearts of people who are over 50. So they're reversing the effectiveness of that pump, so that obviously the oxygen uptake, the pump back out, therefore the improvement on the cardiopulmonary system.
I wonder what the HRV change in that is. Now, I haven't seen anything about that at all in terms of how much that changes HRV as an average.
Because you're de-stressing the body.
Yeah.
So therefore, you've got to get sleep improvements. You've got to get HRV responses that are all positive, because you're just gradually making the engine more and more and more efficient.
Yeah. So someone listening again, how they utilize that, it's probably 3 days a week. It's doing the supersetting approach, the agonist, antagonist. Listening again, it's a push followed by a pull in the main. And that should be built into our perfect week, 3 days per week.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add into that, and that's what research had from Wisconsin, is probably before that is have a look at one of your movement patterns and do it from a pure strength point of view. So, for example, if today you were going to be doing, if you want to do a deadlift, then do your deadlift type movement, but do it to strength, pure strength. Again, beyond foundation, but do pure strength. So bring your reps nice and low, do lots of sets with lots of rest in between, so you can perfect that movement pattern, and then move on to something like the superset, the agonist antagonist supersets, as your then other part of the body plus hypertrophy training. That works incredibly well.
And how and why do we change tempo within each rep that we do? Time under tension changes. Why would we do that, and what's the response neurologically and in terms of strength gain?
Gradually, with all muscle development, it's all just stimulus. Obviously, we don't make muscle stronger by going to the gym. We make muscle stronger by going to the gym, causing localized damage, and therefore the stimulus for the body to then repair itself. So that's why you can train as hard as you like. If you don't sleep well, you don't eat well, you don't recover well, you won't get the effects you're looking for, even though you're training. So exercise by itself doesn't achieve what you want to achieve. What it does do is force the reaction from the body to improve itself. And so the time and attention, by creating more time and attention, you're creating more micro damage. And that micro damage requires the body to heal itself. So it sends out a stronger. So if you're going from your normal reps to a time and attention rep, you just created a lot more damage than you did in the first style of training. So now everybody's going, hang on, what's this person doing? It then goes into a much heightened response mechanism, which is what you want. You've got used to doing that style of training. You've now moved on to this. So you're causing more damage. There are a million different ways of training, and time and attention is just one of them. All of them have a place, and there have been arguments for as long as we've been doing this as to which one is the best way of training. And that argument will continue forever. In reality, the best one for training is whichever one you just moved on to. Because it's a change
You're
from what,
adapting to
you,
something
exactly,
new
it's a
and
change from
different.
what you were doing. So you've just confused the body, this incredible mechanism. You've confused it to throw something new at it where it goes, oh, hang on, we don't know how to respond to this. So let's hyper respond. Let's really go over town on terms of how we deal with this new stimulus, and then you see improvement. So for most people, that's why with a beginner exerciser, you see the greatest change, because it's a huge stimulus they've never had before. So they see this huge uplift in their improvement.
Yeah, well, it's why any sort of body transformation program is always bound to succeed and then doomed to fail. It's inevitably you're going to have this kind of, oh my God, I feel amazing for the first 3, 4, 5 weeks, and you get a pump. And getting a pump is easy. It's just body responding with a whole dump of blood into the muscle to recover from a massive trauma, and then feel, wow, I look in the mirror, I feel like I've pumped myself up. Then leave it alone for a couple of days, of course, just like a balloon deflates again. You haven't actually created any muscle fiber.
No, because it goes back to the same thing we've been saying all along. You've got to have the foundation. And the foundation isn't about to be going there and pumping muscles up. It's about making the body move well, about making the body strong. And then once you've done that, you then try to sort of seek out this new style of training that you keep bringing in, so that you keep confusing the body. The human body, in training terms, after about 6 weeks of doing one style of program, your body's pretty used to it. You're now no longer getting the response, the stimulus that you were getting week 1. So at 6 weeks, you've got to have a plan in place which goes, okay, we're now going to go from doing what we were doing to whether it's time and attention or it's something else. But you've got to bring something else in which confuses that body. And therefore you keep on seeing these improvements all the time.
Yeah.
But just,
Strength's a slow play. Strength is a really, really slow, ongoing process. You can't be strong and expect to become strong within 12 weeks. This is months and
ongoing.
Years of development.
All of this is about constant development and how you play the game of constant development as you go through it. So you've got to keep on having the next plan in place, the next training protocol in place, so that you keep on confusing the body.
In terms of what we add into everything there, I mean, it covers off the strength work pretty well within that. I'll come back to how that fits into the week overall in a second as well. But the other things we can add in that are important, we've touched on Pilates and yoga already slightly, but it's recovery. It's how you then, with all the work that you're doing with all this, you've beaten the body up, you're working in lots of ways. And I say beating up, actually, a lot of the work that we do is sub-maximal.
It's controlled.
It's very much you sub-maximal,
And again,
sub-maximal,
this comes back to that whole polarization training.
Yeah.
The whole point of bringing polarization training was to avoid the exhaustive work and make sure that, again, whether it's strength training or whether it's cardiovascular training, that every time you go out there and train, it's a controlled thing you're doing. You know why you're doing it. Then we'll come back to it. Is it the right day to do it in a second when we talk about data? But you're doing something which has a controlled outcome. You do it in a certain way, and you know you can recover from it. You're not just throwing stuff at it all the time.
So with that in mind, I mean, sleep's a huge factor within this. So if someone's not getting enough sleep, full stop, then it's almost impossible to try and get certainly the high-end stuff done.
Yeah.
So you might survive doing the tick-along stuff, the zone 2 work and reduce intensity on resistance work, etc. But to try and get that real full overload, it's impossible to get up to the high levels if your sleep is less than 6 hours per night.
Unless you feel close to 100%, it's very difficult to get those high intensity work done. You can go and do them, but you're not getting the response. The body's not going to recover in the right way. You probably didn't do enough in the session to get the stimulus that you wanted to get.
And then too, there are drops in human growth hormone, drops in testosterone, often not sleeping for long enough as well, which has a knock-on effect how you then can use the muscle fibers and how they don't really then grow as they should do. So you're constantly in, to your point earlier, high risk of injury. We
saw this with young cyclists and with young triathletes, where their testosterone was way below what you'd think it to be for someone in their early 20s. It's because their workloads were too high. They were going out and doing it.
Workload too high.
Recovery too poor.
Nutrition too poor, too low. Not enough rest time. Not enough hydration. And
so they felt they were ticking the boxes. I went out and did today's session, but actually all they were doing is digging a bigger hole for themselves,
chasing the next thing.
Yeah. But we can all learn from that. That's the whole point. So even that was at one end of the spectrum in terms of fitness levels, but we all have to be very cognizant of what our body is feeling like today, and therefore which bit of our training am I best able to adapt to today.
So taking all that information, actually looking at then how we construct the program for someone. So having understood all those areas, when we're designing a program, it's always really start with that cardio stuff again. it's doing 3 days per week, they should be scheduling doing 40 minutes of zone 2 cardio.
Yep.
Probably sat on a bike, ticking
That's the
along.
easiest to control.
It's more intensity, and that's it. They should do once per week doing a thing which pushes towards being the VO2 training, that very high intensity, probably 3-4 minutes, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. Probably twice a week doing that slightly lesser, certainly lesser duration intervals at the high peak. Still a high peak, but not for as long.
And that one, again, we come to it, but that one's where we start to bring in sport.
Yeah, it might form part of it.
That's the one that could doesn't necessarily need to be gym, exercise type environment.
The only problem with sport is that it takes a certain degree of skill set to retain the intensity that you need. It's the only variable.
Yeah.
So someone who's learning to play tennis, let's say, because they can't hit the ball so great, it breaks down very quickly. So yes, a coach can feed you ball, you're going to get very tired out. It can be done that way. But playing with a friend, if you're both going to be scooping it in the air, then it's quite low.
The ideal is trying to have a sport that's not highly technical, like tennis. And so the pickleball and the paddles and these things, which you have a lower entry level,
keeps you on the move.
Keeps you on moving. And it has, again, those sports tend to be more doubles orientated. So there's a social aspect to it. Human beings we're social beasts. So therefore that building sociability into exercise is really important.
For sustainability it is, isn't it? Yeah, for a long-term approach. On the strength development work, in terms of how we structure that as a week, if we're looking at the 3 to 4 days a week programming, it might be that it's going to be possibly 2 of those sessions might be the supersetting. You might say a third could be pure compound training.
Yeah, I mean, if you're playing 4 days a week, then you're going to have to split the body up to a degree.
Yeah.
And so to make sure that you've got some type of all your push-based movements upper and lower, and then all your pull-based movements upper and lower.
Same session twice a week.
Twice a week potentially, and there are lots of different ways of doing split routines. But if you want to go to the gym 4 times a week, then you're going to have to do that. Otherwise, again, you start to fall into territory of just exhausting the body, and therefore the stimulus not being as effective. So you need to have a look at how cleverly you split all those up, and you always have to question it. It's one thing, like in the idea of going to the gym 4 times a week, but are you actually achieving what you want to achieve, or are you sort of floating around the gym, spending a bit of time on your phone and a bit of time doing exercise? So if we keep talking about this sort of lab routine blueprint, then that's not being in the gym for an hour, but actually spending 15 minutes doing stuff because you were chatting and on your phone and all sorts of things. So you always have to look at efficiency, and so I think the starting point has always got to be, if you were training pure strength twice a week at a high intensity, and you're doing that well, then grow it from there. But that's got to be your base, is to work really hard twice a week.
In terms of how we then construct that week, in the main, the VO2 session on the cardio side is probably on the day which is not a strength training day.
Absolutely.
And the other cardio days, which should be less intensive in some senses, can go on the days when you've got the resistance work going on there, because you aren't going to be quite so fatigued and exhausted. Whether you do it before the resistance work or after resistance work doesn't make a whole lot of difference. It's more actually how you feel off the back of that. And if you go into full overload, you couldn't do resistance work after very well. But you can certainly do your zone 2 work on resistance day easily.
That's also, you got to think about that fueling thing. It's all of these things. I mean, certainly all of your strength work requires fueling for it to be done properly. The idea that you go into the gym in sort of fasted state and try and push weights around doesn't work. You have to fuel for that, and you will have to fuel for the high intensity cardiovascular work. Because again, if we're trying to get some level of proper output, then those all those exercises where you're pushing aerobic up into anaerobic and back down again, you have to fuel that together to get efficiency.
Yeah, and then finally, within how we construct that week with mobility work, it pretty much goes before every resistance session for sure. Probably before some of the high intensity cardio sessions. Less of a necessity with that. But it would benefit to try and get you prepped and ready.
In a week program, so if you know you're going to the gym, say twice a week, and you got your one high intensity cardio, if you've got your your mobility drills ahead of each of those three. So you've got 3 really good mobility sessions per week. That gives you a good foundation.
Yeah.
There's always room that you could do more of it, but as a minimum, putting it ahead of those 3 things would be ideal.
And you might choose to on your day off a mobility session on its own as a standalone anyway.
And also, one of the big things is mobility comes into play, because this happens to all of us as we age. But as soon as you feel a body part feels a little bit sore, a bit tight that day, that's when you do mobility.
Yeah.
So do not ignore it.
Responsive
Mobility is a really, really important thing. One of the first things that we should be doing when a muscle or an area feels like it's just tightened up because of the way you slept or the way you were at work the day before, act on it. Because the longer you leave it, the harder it's going to be to try and get that mobility back into it.
Yeah. Good. Okay, we're covered off for now. We're going to come back in another session on sport-specific strength work and probably on some hypertrophy strength work as well. But in terms of our generic person who wants to live a healthy life for as long as possible or be active as possible, that's the blueprint. That's the way to go about it.
Yeah.
Cool. Perfect. Good. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today in the Evolution Lab. I hope you're able to take some great information and inspiration from our discussion. And while we love creating motivational and moving content for you, what I'd love for you to do now is take from today's episode what felt most relevant to you and apply it. And if you need help with that or simply want to let me know what you thought of the show, please do reach out. You can connect with me and my team on social media simply by searching for my name or the handles @MattRobertsEvolution or @MattRobertsPT. Alternatively, head to my website, mattroberts.co.uk, where you can find out about the work we're doing at Evolution and get even more info about the show. If you found this episode valuable, I'd really appreciate it if you can take a moment to subscribe and let us know what you think about the show. Your support means we can reach even more people, change more lives, and reach even higher highs. Thank you so much again for taking the time to tune in today. Until next time, I'm Matt Roberts, and this has been the Evolution Lab.